Hello, welcome all, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, for this latest in our series of In Conversation events. Let me just begin by giving you a few of the housekeeping rules. This is being broadcast simultaneously on both Zoom and on YouTube. If you're on the Zoom side of the conversation, then please put any questions you might have for our speaker in the Q&A part of the Zoom box right at the bottom. If you're on YouTube, I'll try and keep an eye out for your questions as well. But it's on the Zoom side where the Q&A is there for you to use. So that's where we want your questions. Chat away in the chat, but put your questions in the Q&A, and whenever they pop into your head, right? So if you've got a question now, put it in the Q&A. We've got a fantastic guest with us tonight. I'm joined by a dear friend of freedom and of the IEA, Dominic Frisby. Welcome, sir. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you with us. You are a comedian, presenter, actor, voice actor, songwriter, singer, author, financial writer and YouTuber, a true libertarian polymath. Is that a fair word?
Freelancer. A
freelancer, an all-round, quite a portfolio here. You are the resident MC at London's oldest comedy venue. You make many fantastic videos on your YouTube channel, Dominic Frisby Comedy Videos. Your recent hit, which we're going to come to shortly, is called I Love Wetherspoons. I want to question you quite tightly on that one. You've also released the national anthem of Libertaria, which also has a full choir version. Bowel Movements in A minor, Lockdown Blues, and of course the infamous and brilliant 17 Million F-Offs, a song about Brexit. You also do voiceover work for an array of documentaries, adverts, promos, cartoons and all the rest. When you're not creating material to make us laugh, you're a financial writer and analyst to make us cry, I gather, pretty much, right? You have another YouTube channel.
Seeking out opportunity.
Seeking out opportunity, okay. You have another YouTube channel named Money, Markets and More with Dominic Frisby, where you offer your outlook on the economy and a whole array of financial issues. You're a Moneyweek contributor. You've written several books on finance and economics, including one on Bitcoin and another titled Daylight Robbery, which is going to be having pride of place here on the IEA radiator just behind us, in which you undertook the fairly small and trivial task of writing about the entire history of taxation and civilization in one book. And you reckon that's your best book yet?
I think so.
So thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, we had a roadmap to get you here, and we were initially going to kick off at 6 o'clock, but I warned everybody that we had to take this roadmap very cautiously and listen to the experts, and it had to be irreversible when we actually went live. So we did decide to go for a short delay once I listened to the scientific experts in the comms department that the Prime Minister was addressing the nation when we were initially due to go live. And of course, he's just kicked the sort of can down the road largely on Freedom Day. There might be a break clause if the data goes spectacularly well. I think there's some liberalisations around weddings, but pretty much we're going to be in this last period of lockdown until the middle of July. What do you make of that, and what do you make of this whole lockdown shenanigans we've been going through for the last year?
Well, I'm really disappointed with the decision. I'm not surprised by it. I think a health and safety mentality has taken over politics and controls pretty much every decision. You could see him in his speech burying himself behind the plan, you know, and using the plan as his defence. And, you know, in the same way that in another age somebody would have used the Bible or something to protect their, you know, that is his philosophy, the plan, that is his guide. And I've got to say, I think it's the wrong decision. You know, I'm not no COVID expert, but at a certain point you've got to open up. I think, as Theresa May gave a wonderful speech in Parliament last week.
I'd never ever thought I'd heard those words.
Yeah, nor me. I mean, I think she should be Prime Minister, quite frankly. And but she was saying, you know, it's with us. It's just part of our lives now. And if the vaccines work, you know, those who want to have the vaccine have had it. And if you know, and really, it's only the under 40s who haven't had it, and the under 40s, for the most part, don't seem to die from COVID. It's the over 50s who are at most risk. So, you know, I think the vulnerable are mostly protected, and if they're not protected, it's through their own choice. So I think you just got to say, we've got to open up, we've got to get back to normal, we really do. And just, I mean, the lockdown that came in January was a real blow. For example, my daughter had a new boyfriend and she loved her boyfriend. She couldn't see her boyfriend for 3 months. You know, there was loads of things like that. And this, I mean, I know that's a petty reason not to open up.
No, that of itself.
But there were just tiny...
I assume you wrote a very stiff letter to the Prime Minister about that.
I said, do you understand what my daughter's going through here? But the... yeah, so I just think it's a real disappointment, and it shows lack of cojones. And I've got to say, you know, all the stuff Boris used to write in the Telegraph and the speeches he used to make, you used to think, you know, here's a champion of freedom, here's a champion of individual responsibility, and he's incapable of living to the laws by which the government set himself. You know, he's famously incompetent and bumbling, and, you know, if you kind of want him to live by his principles, and it seems he's in the hands of other people who we don't know who they are. Okay,
I'm going to try and marshal a defence for our Prime Minister. This is not going to be easy, but bear with me.
Are you broadly on side with what I just said there?
I am broadly on side, but it's my job to... It's going to be very, very boring if we just agree with each other about everything.
Summon your inner Paxman now.
Yeah. So here's the problem, though. I mean, you mentioned, OK, January was a bleak time. This is a real... like, lockdowns and the state trying to deal with a pandemic, this is a really problematic issue for us freedom lovers and libertarian-minded people, right? Because in virtually all area of government activity, you and I have a kind of automatic, knee-jerk and completely correct response, which is the government shouldn't be doing this, this is no business of the government. But in this sort of particular case, a pandemic, something that is an other-regarding thing, you know, if you act irresponsibly and go to India and get the virus and start spreading it around here at the IEA, we're all in trouble. I mean, we at the IEA have been divided on this topic, but also somewhat confused about what is the rational, classical liberal, pro-freedom approach, unless you go the whole hog and just say, no lockdowns ever, you know, people will die, so be it, you know, choose your own path in life. I suppose if there is anything that I think government should do, it probably is to solve these sort of collective action problems, these externality problems. It's not protecting us from ourselves. I hate the government doing that, but it is that your actions can impact somebody else. Real headache for a classical liberal.
Yeah, I mean, does it come? I suppose it comes under the category defence of the nation. Does it?
I guess, yeah. You could.
I mean, or
it's been likened to a war in quite a large number of ways, right? Yeah.
So, I don't know. I mean, when it first happened, I was as paralysed as everyone else. I didn't really know what the answer was, but looking back, I can't help thinking that a voluntarist approach would have resulted in as good an outcome as we currently have, if not a better one.
Interesting. Right the way from the outset, you think?
I think so. I think, again, it's so easy in hindsight.
Yeah.
But close the borders for a bit, and then voluntarist approach at home. For example, in Guernsey and Sark, they basically shut their borders and nobody has to wear masks.
Well, there you go. That might have been one way to deal with it. Now, I want to ask you about another aspect of this, because I'll tell you something that surprised me. I'm always surprised by decisions politicians make. Or, you know, I mean, I should have learnt by now, but they always seem more stupid and counterproductive than I would ever have expected. I think we've got to that stage now. I just simply don't believe they're doing any cost-benefit analysis, right, which would still a central planning way of looking at things, but that's gone out the window, right? It's just, we're now just, I put on Twitter earlier, we're now just in, you know, nobody must die category. You know, the government, Rod Liddell wrote a brilliant piece in the Sunday Times on it's now the government policy that you must not die. You know, this is the new government policy. But I'll tell you something that has genuinely surprised me, is the lack of resistance. If you told me just over a year ago that, you know, there would be all these things that British people cannot do, I mean, incredibly intrusive action, I would have thought, well, they might be patient for a week or two or a month or two, but, I mean, you're not going to be able to make this stick. Even now, today, if you believe the opinion polls, a majority of people want delay. It's amazing how people adapt to losing.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people want delay. I can it's an aggregation of several things. You're right about the lack of resistance. I mean, where's the resistance coming from? Desmond Swain, Steve Baker, Lawrence Fox. I mean, you can count them on, you know, the fingers of one hand. And you find these polls where people support the lockdown. I mean, you've seen the famous Yes Minister sketch when he shows you how to manipulate a poll by the questions that lead up to the actual question. So you wonder if some of that's going on. You wonder if some people are lying to polls, because people often do lie to pollsters because they're worried about how their answer might make them look. But I also think if people felt the consequences of this lockdown in their pockets, then that would change their outlook. So, for example, I still think we've got like 2 million people on furlough. If they weren't being paid to do nothing, then they might have a very different attitude. Sure. If we didn't have this rampant asset price inflation, you know, a lot of people who own assets, a house, stocks, Bitcoin, whatever the asset is, have had one of the best investment years they've ever had over the last 18 months. And that's basically as a result of printed money pushing up asset prices. If that hadn't happened, and the prices of assets reflected what's actually happening in the real economy, then those polls might deliver a very different result.
We're going to get the worst of all worlds then, aren't we? We're going to get people who, if you like, the bulk of the population saying or actually being on the side of lockdown while it is happening, and then being against it in retrospect. Right? In a year's time, when all the problems associated with this, you know, the cost of the furlough scheme, they're going to say, oh, we should never have locked down for as long. Yeah,
well, some will. I also think, I don't know what it is. It must be a human nature thing, but it seems to be worse than ever. Maybe it's just because it's more apparent to me than ever. There's just this attitude that nobody wants to see anyone else getting on. You know, it's a real envy thing, politics of envy or whatever, but, you know, I'm locking down, so you should as well. Well, you lock down if that suits your circumstances, but if other people want to go out and do whatever they have to do, then really does it affect you? But that people don't seem to like that. That's
been particularly curious as well. That I mean, it seems that increasingly in the modern world, discretion on how you behave seems to be removed. Things are either mandatory or prohibited. And talking about lockdown, some people are sort of, oh well, you know, no. I mean, I think there should be a delay. I'm not ready to go down the pub yet. I'm not ready to go to a football match yet. So yeah, you won't be forced to. Right? The option isn't whether you're banned from going to the pub or forced to go to the pub. It's if you want to stay at home and shield, be my guest. You might even have good reasons for doing so. But there seems to be, don't you think, that sort of liberty is being absolutely squeezed in the middle, that just, you know, we're either all going to, you know, do this or none of us are going to do this. There's no individual discretion, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's this sort of thing, you know, this central planning, one rule for everybody thing. And, you know, in our anarchist libertaria where we're retiring to one day, I haven't still quite worked out where it existed, you know, there are no rules, and so people do, if you want to go out, you go out. If you want to stay in, you go in. And there isn't this, well, I don't think it's right that you should do this, and therefore you can't do it. Well, you might think it's right that you do this.
Timothy Worrell asks on this theme. Timothy's one of our IA online patrons, so Timothy, good to have you with us. He asks, why has liberty become a toxic concept and libertarian become such a slur?
I don't know, but, you know, I remember growing up and thinking that if you favoured free markets, there was something wrong with you. You were bad and evil. Because Thatcher's championing of free markets, which is what I grew up with, was used by the left it meant you're only interested in exploiting people. It ignored the fact that if I give the shopkeeper money and he gives me an item, we both benefit. That's how you know, markets work. So free market became a toxic thing, and that has now evolved to free trade somehow is a bit less toxic. But now the new one is free speech. You know, free speech means hate speech. And I don't know why this has happened, but somehow it gets the you know, I think it's this sort of culture of the minority opinion controlling the majority the majority discourse, the majority law. It's quite hard to articulate, but those who oppose it seem to frame the argument that if you are in favour of freedom, somehow you are in favour of exploitation. Somehow being in favour of freedom makes you a fascist.
Yeah, no, I agree. This has become extreme. But hasn't the tool they've really been used that I just find bizarre, not the way it's legally used, but culturally used, is people who say things which are deemed to be offensive, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't care if people offend me. You know, I can still sleep at night. I don't, generally like being offended, but it doesn't. But that now seems to be a barrier to any sort of expression, right? So, I mean, I thought this was farcical at the G7 summit. Macron apparently sort of said, well, Northern Ireland's not really part of the United Kingdom. And then the whole news story is our Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, says that was highly offensive. I don't care whether it's offensive or not. It's just wrong. It's just actually factually inaccurate.
He literally didn't know. And to be perfectly honest with you, Mark, I get confused between what is the United Kingdom and what is Great Britain. So there's this no surprise that Macron should.
But I think we've got to get off this hook of everybody going around in a clinical state of shock and offence. On the lockdown thing, this is,
I wish I could just get the left and give them a long lecture and say, if you stand for freedom, broadly speaking, you are against coercion, you are against violence, you are for peaceful outcomes, and so on and so forth. And it is big government that is the perpetrator of the worst crimes against humanity throughout all history. And therefore we are in favour of small government. That does not make me a fascist. That actually makes me, a benevolent, peace-loving person. I wish I could, but the left just do not seem to get that.
Well, I know that you're a wonderful, peace-loving person, Dominic, but you also have a brilliant tendency to poke and irritate the other side in a brilliantly mischievous way. I mentioned in the introduction some of the songs you've done. Your latest one, now talk me through this, is I Love Wetherspoons.
Yeah.
We'll put a link to this in the chat and on the show notes on YouTube.
Were you amused?
I was amused, but do you really love Wetherspoons?
Yeah.
Or have you just become a corporate shill for Wetherspoons?
Somebody said...
Who funded you?
Well, somebody put in the comments that Wetherspoons equals fascism.
Right.
Because national and corporate interests are aligned. And I'm like, since when was... It just sells cheap beer. Wetherspoons is a happy place. And I did this song in my act a couple of years ago, and it made a lot of people laugh. We did it, and I met Tim Martin on January the 31st, and I said to him, "Can I film it? Can I come and film this song in one of your pubs?" And he goes, "Yeah, sure." And then lockdown came along, and we just never got round to it. And then there was like a tiny window, and so we filmed it then. And I got a bunch of comedians. We all did it, and they're all cheapskate comedians who like Wetherspoons. And I do like Wetherspoons, and it's funny. I mean, what's wrong with Wetherspoons? It just sells cheap beer. And it's a place that people go because, even if you're skint, you feel like a millionaire in Wetherspoons. It makes people feel good about themselves.
So does Wetherspoons sum up for you the kind of freedom-loving capitalist Britain you want to live in?
Not exactly, but for some reason, liking Wetherspoons is again makes me a fascist and winds up the wrong.
But is this just because Tim Martin, who's great, the owner of it, he's outspoken and says what he thinks, and he was on the Brexit side. It's
entirely what it is. And I played in a cricket match at the weekend, and with all my stupid, deluded left-wing metropolitan liberal elite friends, and they were all giving me stick about doing the song, and they were saying it's really political. And I'm saying, why is it political doing a song about liking a pub brand?
Yeah.
And they were going all this, and none of them have ever been in Wetherspoons.
Right.
And they're not Wetherspoons' target audience, and they hate it. And all the people that are like trying to get Wetherspoons banned, attacking it on social media, yada yada, they're all people who never go there.
They're all gastro-pub with their...
yeah, I like gastro-pubs too. I like pubs.
So that's why I love Wetherspoons.
I also think what Wetherspoons... When Wetherspoons came up, the pub was an endangered species in the 1980s. They were full of loud music, and the 90s, Sky TV, they'd lost touch with what pubs should be. Mm-hmm. And there was no live music, very little television. It's great going into Wetherspoons pub and going to a venue where all you hear
is chitter-chat.
Yeah, It's really peaceful.
So you see, this we got to talk more about. You need to do more songs like. It's like the free market has actually brought around the hub of the community, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and that's very much in your video. You show that it's a sort of, this is where people gather and have a cheap pint and
if you want diversity, go to and equality and all the rest of it. Go
to Wetherspoons. Go to Wetherspoons, and it's okay. Well, we've touched on, and I wish them well, because obviously this delay in hospitality reopening for another month. You know, it's getting harder and harder.
Yeah.
For everybody in that sector.
I know, and have you been to a pub recently?
Yes.
And have you had to go through the whole thing with the app and then try and get a signal from your phone?
It's ridiculous.
Please, Lord, can I not just speak to a human being?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think
that's what this virus has done, is taken humanity out of society. From the mask wearing to the apps to the things, people don't relate anymore. And I'm sure that's why there's all these, everyone's shouting at everyone.
Yeah, although I think that my impression, I won't name any of the hostelries that I visited in the particular local area, and I don't want to land myself in trouble either, but my strong sense is, how should I put this? Enforcement is increasingly with a lighter touch. That I think that, you know, some months ago there would have been sort of tape measures out about exactly how close your table was to the next one. Now, you know, as long as, you know, you're not packed in shoulder to shoulder, I think they're quite...
Yeah.
I mean, I can't remember what the rule is now. It's only 6 people from 2 households at a table or something, isn't it? Nobody's asked me to prove the households of the people around a table.
It was listening to an interview with your man Christian Niemitz once upon a time, where he talked about, somebody was asking about what the German government would do in a certain situation, and he said, oh, they'll take the hypocritical route. They'll say one thing, but they'll just turn a blind eye to it. And it's amazing how much of that goes on, and I think that very dynamic is creeping into public policy.
Okay, let's move on to your book and some of the themes in that. So, you know, let's hope we get back to something approaching normality, if not in the 3rd week of June, in the 3rd week of July. I was a big fan of this book, as you can probably notice from
You're on the
spectacular, I say, on the back cover. Really interesting. You tried to map out the entire history of taxation. Tell us the broad theme of this, because if I remember rightly, it's a couple of years since I've read it now. Your idea was, I'm going to write about tax, but then you decided you had to go through the entire sort of history of human civilization in order to get there.
Yeah, well, the fundamental theme of the book is that there's never been a society without taxation. And the anarchists dream of a society, there's never been a civilization without taxation. And, you know, this idea of a duty to the greater collective will have existed in the hunter-gatherer societies that predated civilization. And even in the sort of libertarian idyll that is Bitcoin, there exists taxation in the form of miners' fees and transaction costs. So even it's a voluntary form of taxation. You don't have to pay it if you don't want.
But isn't that the difference? If you don't have, I mean, tax isn't really tax if it's voluntary, is it?
Well, the ancient Greece taxes were voluntary, and if you follow Rory Sutherland, I don't know if you read Rory Sutherland, the advertising guru, you know, he argues for, you know, voluntary additional payments where you get little rewards for doing those things. And I believe if we introduced a voluntary element to our taxes today, if somebody had the imagination and the vision and the technical know-how to do that, you'd actually get far greater government revenue would result from it. It's because it's compulsory and the giver gets nothing for it that this culture exists of trying to pay the least possible. But anyway, the fundamental thing is not only has there never existed a civilization without taxation, it's actually taxation that has guided the entire course of human history.
Yeah, I love these sort of grand theories.
And if you start to, exactly.
But by looking at the marginal rate at the highest rate of income tax, you can predict the future of the world or something. Is that what you're saying?
Well,
not quite, but
the way taxation, you design a society by the way you tax it. You determine how prosperous or how poor the people are going to be, how free they're going to be, or how subordinated. Taxation itself, the degree to which an individual is taxed, is a measure of freedom. In an anarchy, you have, let me just get rid of that. Sorry, I can't talk right now. In an anarchy, let's say it actually existed, you have zero taxes. The human being has total ownership of his own body and his own labour. In a totalitarian state, the human being has no ownership of his own labour. In a slave state, he doesn't even own his own body. And we in the social democracies of today, at 50% taxation, give or take, we're in the middle ground.
Yeah. Which I've always said is not the most obvious place to be, right?
No, how can a worker only own half of his own labour? But anyway, the destiny of a society is determined by the way it's taxed. 100%.
That's really. And now I was going to ask you about where you think the taxable limits are of the economy, because one of the things I sort of worry about a lot, but I also think that, if you like, some of the iron laws of economics could end up coming down on our side. We're obviously piling up colossal debt, not just because of the pandemic and all of the costs associated with that, but generally speaking.
It was already a problem before.
Yeah, it wasn't as if, we had been saving into our sovereign wealth fund for 20 years for just this sort of eventuality. We were sort of maxing out the credit card anyway, and then another crisis hits and things get worse and worse and worse. And of course, as we go down, as we've heard previously and we'll hear again, the argument goes, well, those with the broadest shoulders need to, take up much of the burden, and all of this is necessary, and presumably taxes will start to go up. We've seen this with corporation tax, for example. A Conservative government putting up corporation tax, but we're going to have to put taxes up a lot more than this if we want to start beginning to address not just the furlough scheme, the pensions time bomb, demographic changes. How the hell is social care going to be paid for because we haven't saved for it? But do you have any sense of whether, and it will be different, I appreciate, in different periods of history and in different societies today, is there a taxable limit to the economy? Presumably at some point, if the British government, and I wouldn't rule anything out now, said, bad news, guys, income tax is 99%. Well, we all just leave.
Well, people stop working.
So actually their revenues would fall.
Yeah.
So, at some point the Laffer curve sort of kicks in and they would realise that wouldn't raise them more revenue. So there's sort of some, now historically here, I say historically, in the UK, over the course of my lifetime, that seems to be about 38-39% of GDP, somewhere around there is the most you can squeeze out. If your overarching aim is, as the government, I want to squeeze every last goddamn penny I can from it's about 38-39%. Do you think different societies have different taxable limits? And do you think now today, if you like, there will be an adjustment because we are basically at the taxable limit? You can't wish for more government spending unless you're happy to cut other areas of it. Yeah,
well, I do think different circumstances, people will accept different taxable situations under different circumstances. So I think, for example, if there was a national emergency, a war, World War II, World War I, people were happier to pay higher levels of tax. The great irony is higher taxes do not necessarily lead to higher government revenue.
Oh, no, for sure. Yeah.
And, I bet if you reduce the higher rate of income tax to 40% or even 35 or even 30%, the net result would be greater government revenue because of the increased economic activity that would be stimulated.
Especially over the long term, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Even if you had slightly more modest revenues in year one,
And, this was a law that Laffer argued, and early Islam, people struggled to explain how Islam grew so quickly in the 7th century, and the reason is low taxes.
Yeah.
that empire was built on low taxes, and anyone who converted to Islam avoided the poll tax, and so everyone converted to Islam. It was a tremendous, and Laffer was quick to acknowledge the early Islamic philosophers.
Yes, he doesn't claim to be the inventor of the Laffer curve. He merely gave his name to it.
And taxation takes many forms. There's direct taxes that we all know about, income tax and VAT and so on. But inflation is a tax in itself. It's a way of extracting wealth. It's a stealth tax. Debt is a tax on the future. All these are all different means by which, and I don't know how current spending is to be paid for. We have runaway asset price inflation. It doesn't get mentioned in the numbers because they only measure CPI, and CPI is prone to China exporting its low labour costs, the competitiveness of productivity driving down costs. CPI, I think, only measures about only about 13% of newly created money actually goes into the goods that are measured in CPI, if that makes sense, and they're prone to the deflationary forces of increased productivity. You know, it doesn't measure financial assets, it doesn't measure property prices, none of those things. And so I just think we carry on this horrible trend that we are.
At some point those it goes capital, pop, right? Greece. Not
people have been saying Greece, that for years. It should go pop, and it doesn't. And, you know, maybe it's just one of those things. It will keep doing, and then suddenly it goes, and then it all looks obvious in the rearview mirror. I mean, I have to say, I do think that day is coming, but you can't carry on spending and debasing the money. I mean, the left-wing economists, in a funny kind of way, they've been proved right, because they would argue that you spend first and tax later. And MMT and quantitative easing, it's kind of worked. For me, I think it's evil because it's created so much inequality, and it's continued a system that needed to purge itself and change. And, you know, but nevertheless, they'll be right.
It hasn't collapsed, you could say. Yeah, I got it.
But now, I mean, but just look at what a pound buys you now compared to what a pound buys you bought you 10 years ago.
But don't jump the gun. I'm going to come on to inflation in just a minute. I want to press you on another tax idea, because you might oftentimes say that the likes of the Frisbees and the Littlewoods go around saying, oh, don't tax as much, do less, do all the rest of it. But you actually have an alternative proposal in this book. You sort of outline your ideal utopia. Mm-hmm. You know, what should tax look like then? And, you know, obviously you and I will point out all the things which are too high and inefficient and on the wrong side of the Laffer curve, but actually you have a proposal which is the only tax that you would impose if you could design society from the bottom up, blank sheet of paper, is a location usage tax. Scrap all taxes on incomes and sales and everything else, just a location usage tax, a land tax.
Yeah.
A land tax.
But not what's on the land.
Okay, no, I understand. So just talk me through that. What would you actually tax to get revenues for the state?
Well, when I have the final chapter of the book, Designing Utopia, I basically follow the Hong Kong model, because Hong Kong was the most extraordinary economic success story of the second half of the 20th century. And there was no income tax except for the very highest earners. And 40% of government revenue came from taxing the value of land. 40%. For us at the moment, it's like 2% or something. And, you know, if you want everyone goes, we must tax the Queen, we must tax the Queen. She has hardly any income. If the Queen has to pay income tax, it really doesn't make that much difference. Yeah. You know, the wealth of the Crown is in all the land it owns. Mm-hmm. So if you tax the value, and it's had that land since about 1066. It's like, you know, surely it's time to, you know, share it out a bit. Great.
So you've got some sort of radical Republican tendencies that might appeal to that. But why land? Why not income?
Because income is as a result of human endeavour. Mm-hmm. The land was always there. Nobody made it. So it should be the wealth of the land should be shared by everyone. Yeah. If you build a house on that land, that's as a result of your endeavour, and the value of that house should be yours. But the underlying value of the land.
So this is Henry George's land value tax idea, single tax idea, and because you're sort of treating land as kind of morally a communal asset. If you want to monopolise a chunk of it, then you should compensate the community for the bit that you've put a garden fence around. If you then improve your house or whatever, your council tax can go up. So we just face one flat tax on the value of the land we own.
Yeah, and it's a transparent tax. You know, so if government is spending too much and that reflects in higher land value taxes, immediately the landowner will hold the government to account. It creates a very healthy.
Why doesn't that happen with regards to, say, income tax?
Because income tax is deducted at source.
Right. Okay. So would you? Yeah. That's so you're saying people don't really see it.
They don't feel it.
So this would be a bill you'd get through your front door saying you own this number of acres, or you know this.
And if you don't pay the tax, you sell the land.
You sell the land.
Yeah. You use less. It's funnily enough, like I wrote an article about land value tax. And the Duke of Westminster, after the Duke of Westminster died, and the next Duke of Westminster inherited estate without paying any inheritance tax. And there's so many inconsistencies in our tax system. And I wrote an article, and John McDonnell, then the Chancellor, the Shadow Chancellor, was sharing it like mad. This is what we need, brethren, this is what we need. And the idea of a land value tax is one of these weird things, a bit like Brexit, which allies the sort of Thatcherite right of the Conservative Party and the I don't know, the Bennite left of the Labour Party. And there's this, it's one of those weird things where they both agree. They probably don't agree on the rate payable, but they agree on the principle of it.
That's really, really interesting. Let me just take a couple of questions from the chat as well, which touch on some of the issues that we come to, because I want to come to Bitcoin.
By the way, I don't think land value tax will ever happen.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that.
You know, I'm all for advocating stuff that won't happen.
With the IEA, you're supposed to think the unthinkable and say the unsayable, right? The art of the possible is somebody else's headache.
The biggest problem with land value tax is it's so hard to explain.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds a bit weird and niche, doesn't it?
Yeah, and everyone's just going to, I'm going to get taxed on the value of my house, and that's the most valuable thing I own.
And it's not the house, it's the land it sits on. We touched on earlier about whether, you know, freedom has become a kind of dirty word. People don't value it as much as they used to. Ian Taylor asks, are these poll results, I think he's referring to when we were sort of saying most people seem to want to continue with delay. You were saying, well, that's because they haven't felt the consequences of it. Are these poll results the result of a sustained policy of scaremongering that's turned people into something resembling a medieval mob screaming burn the witch?
Almost certainly.
Right. Do you think this is really interesting? Do you think the government has that much power over it? So, I mean, on the one hand, everybody says, I don't believe a word that politicians say. You know, you can tell a politician's lying because their lips move. Well, I think it's the media, and etc. And then suddenly, I'm asked to believe that the government can run an advertising campaign that leaves Coca-Cola and Disney and everybody else for dead. Where are their advertising geniuses? Whoever's come up with this scaremongering campaign should make a fortune in the private sector as an advertiser then, right? You get people to buy your products.
They will have hired Saatchi and whoever to do it. I have to say, I think it's the media that's been doing a lot of the scaremongering, more than it is the government. But propaganda is one thing that governments throughout history seem to do very well. You know, you look at Soviet or Cuba, and you might say, well, pretty incompetent governments, but their propaganda was excellent.
And the media, that's interesting. Why are they complicit in this? What's gone wrong there then?
Well, they sensationalise everything. That's how they get people to watch.
Right, but wouldn't it be sensational to prove that the government's massively exaggerating the scale of the problem?
There's more career risk in taking the line that we must have more freedom because that makes you a murderer.
Right.
There's far greater career risk. It's much less career risk to go, we need to protect people.
Okay. Now, I want to move on to one of your great loves, hobbies, Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, right? Now, I've started studying this in some depth, especially once you started to persuade me it would have been a good way to get rich if only I'd studied it earlier.
I did a talk downstairs.
You did here at the IEA.
Rory Kellen, what's his name, from BBC, telling us that Bitcoin would never take off, and his reason for that was he wore a Google goggles. Do you remember those Google goggles? Yeah. And he said, look at these don't work. And, and it was Bitcoin was and Bitcoin was £100 at the time. Right.
Okay. So that seems to me a curious argument that because one piece of technology doesn't work, that no piece of technology.
Well, I think the point he was making, to be fair to him, is that just because it's a new technology doesn't.
No, it doesn't guarantee its success. Yeah. And you know, I'm not.
But he's been wildly wrong about it. Ever since the onset.
But let me just help me here. I'm trying to get my head around it, right? So it seems to me that money, I could store money in a number of ways. I mean, sterling has an advantage in that it's easily transactable, right? I mean, go about my day-to-day life, I guess I don't use notes now anymore, hardly at all. I don't use notes and coins, but it has a convenience level to it. So I want to keep a basic float in sterling so I can, you know, tip somebody or buy a pint of beer or, you know, pay the cab driver or whatever.
It becomes more problematic if you want to pay someone in America, though.
No, I understand that. That does become more problematic. But generally speaking, I pay people in Britain, by and large. Also, with, say, sterling, although I don't...
Can I just interrupt you? Bitcoin is a borderless money for a borderless media.
I want to hear all the... I'm just trying to get my head around what it is, basically, right?
Okay.
So, if I stash a whole load of tenors under my bed, or, you know, more likely store that in my savings account, I promise to pay the bearer, blah, 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 blah. Now, look, I'm the last person who trusts the state, central bankers and politicians. But I kind of feel, you know, sterling ain't going to completely disappear. You know, the government's going to have to back it to an extent. It'll probably devalue. You know, probably a £10 note I've got now will not have the same purchasing power in a year's time, let alone 10 years' time. But it'll have some purchasing power, right? A £10 note might be worth £8 then. Okay, that'll sort of do. You know, I might just have to have a pint and a half rather than 2 pints. So I can sort of live with it. If I invested in stocks and shares, I understand what I'm getting. Okay, I now own 0.0001% of this company. Or in fine art, you know, I guess that Van Gogh could go out of fashion, but if I own 1% of a Van Gogh painting, unless it can. If I buy a Bitcoin, what do I have?
Digital gold.
But really, what can I do with this gold? If I own gold, I can make jewellery out of it. If I own a Bitcoin, I have an invisible digital necklace. How's anybody? I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate. How's anybody fallen for this? It's just a bloody algorithm. It's not a thing.
There's two things you need to get clear in your head. You need to distinguish between the physical economy and the digital economy. The physical economy, since 1990 or whatever, has grown at, 3-4% acceptable, 2, maybe 1, maybe in a bad year. The digital economy has had a scalability because of the instant replicability of digital technology that has just obliterated anything that the physical economy has to offer.
No, I get that. So I understand why having shares in Amazon would have value. That's part of the digital economy. They have a proposition that we can get books and other things to you faster and more convenient than Waterstones, say, or we can get DVDs faster to you than HMV. So HMV are out. But I get that. I just don't understand what this digital currency is and why I should trust it.
That you should trust it because it's all set in code and nobody can change the code and it's totally transparent. And if you wanted to,
there's no intrinsic value, right?
Its value is determined by what the market,
the
market, what people are prepared to pay.
So I'm just a bit worried. Help me here. The market's gone mental. I understand why Amazon has value. It could go out of fashion. I understand why a Van Gogh painting has value. It could go out. I understand why sterling has value. I don't understand. There's no intrinsic value in a Bitcoin.
How much value has sterling lost over the last 100 years?
Oh, 98% or something?
Correct, yeah.
Right.
And, a pound of sterling was once a pound of silver.
No, I get that. But I'm not suggesting that the sensible thing to do is to put all of your assets into cash and put them under your bed. I'm using cash transactionally. I'm generally putting it in stocks and shares. So I own a very small proportion of a range of companies.
Yeah, and the stock market, the S&P 500 has basically become America's savings vehicle.
Yeah.
And it yields 5, 10, 15% a year, whatever. And it yields what putting their money in a savings account would have yielded perhaps in the 70s or 80s. And so the S&P keeps going up because, as I say, it's America's savings vehicle. Now, I talked about the replicability of digital technology. In the old days, if you wanted to make a cassette of a record, you'd have to, if you wanted to make 20 copies, you'd have to have 20 cassette players and you play your record and then you'd have to do it 20 times. Digital, you can instantly replicate anything, a million or a billion, how many times. And that's why the digital economy has experienced this huge growth. The genius of Bitcoin was it created digital scarcity. Now, this was the breakthrough. Do you understand? Digital growth has grown now where Bitcoin is scarce. There can only ever be 21 million. The inflation rate is transparent. And it's become a digital store of wealth.
Okay. And it's not, I mean, I don't want to say it's a confidence trick. It clearly isn't. But my worry is it's based entirely on a judgment about its future prospects. There's nothing. Do you see what I mean about there's nothing intrinsic there? I mean, Amazon might go bust, but you can see that
the underlying value of
sterling
Bitcoin
will almost certainly go down.
The underlying value of Bitcoin is the computer network, the extraordinary energy that's gone into maintaining that computer network. If you look at money as a form of stored energy, so your labour, you expend all this labour and you receive this money, this stored energy in exchange for your labour that you can use. Bitcoin is stored energy. It's created by computer power. And it's stored energy. It's verified by this extraordinarily powerful computer network. Its money is set. It's completely voluntary. Its value is set by the market.
And do you think then, is this not just like, intriguing and interesting and so newfangled that it's hard for, old farts like me to get their head around it. Is this revolutionary going back to the tax point? I mean, if we can all send each other things in, you know, encrypted codes for transactions, how the hell, going back to this, is the government going to
It's got a big problem on its hands.
If we could only previously use sterling or seashells or something, you know, or a bag of gold or whatever it might be, you can sort of easily tax those things. If you and I can now transact through an encrypted exchange of bitcoins, or I start paying the IEA staff in bitcoins, not sterling, how the heck is the government going to raise any revenue? I mean, I don't necessarily say that as a threat. That might well be a good thing.
It's a huge long-term problem that governments have on their hands, and they think so much in the short term they don't realise what a big long-term problem it is. The fastest growing workforce in the world is the digital nomad. The digital nomad makes his payments, and accepts his payments in Bitcoin. Straight away, the government uses its huge source of revenue, which is the inflation tax. Gone. Secondly, it loses its power to deduct taxes at source. And, you know, time and time again, the evidence is people who pay taxes, you know, the freelancer doing the same job as the regular employee pays a lower level of tax. He finds more things to write out. There's more scope for non-compliance, either accidental or deliberately. You know, one of the reasons why income tax has been so effective is that it's this ability to deduct it at source. That goes. And the other thing is if you think of how difficult the global corporations have been to tax, because they've got their IP here, their headquarters there, their trademarks here, their profits are somewhere else. They've outwitted tax systems because the tax systems are designed around physical economies. They haven't got to grips with the digital economy. Well, Bitcoin does the same for the worker.
Right.
It effectively, you know, if you think of, and particularly as the worker starts travelling around, you know, the Brazilian guy who lives in England, who's hired to do a graphic design job by a Japanese guy, and then by the time he's finished the job, he's in Chiang Mai, and who does he pay tax to? You know, this is the world, the life of the digital nomad, and there'll be 1 billion of them by 2035.
But then, if you like, didn't we see the early signs? You're right, politicians only deal with the sort of immediate, the crises, tomorrow's headlines, but the G7 with this sort of minimum global corporation tax beginning to wake up to we've got to have some sort of agreement across the scale. So if you're not paying it in Singapore, you've got to be paying it. So people will
relocate to the 8th country on the list, whatever's the 8th. You know, that's what's going to happen.
So there's a permanent race between the state power and
it's the same dance, but the world we're going. Did you ever read a book by Lord Rees-Mogg called The Sovereign Individual?
I didn't, no.
Okay, well that's the world we're going into.
Right. Well, there's another recommendation. We'll put a link to that in the chat as well. And then inflation. Now you've touched on this. I said no. We'll come to that. We'll come to that. You've been warning for years about the dangers of QE, its impact on inflation. I find monetary policy, as I've just explained on Bitcoin, quite hard to get my head around. But I wrote in my Times article today that without making a forecast, that seems to me that all of the elements that you'd expect to generate inflation are now sort of here. And so we should brace ourselves for a bout of it. And inflation's one of those terrible things that sort of, you can't sort of nip it in the bud particularly easily. You need to put in place things that don't give rise to it. Once it's out, Hayek compared it to trying to catch the tiger by the tail.
Once the money's printed.
It's pretty different. So my first question to you is, why hasn't this arisen before, right? Folk who've been saying don't print money, you mentioned it earlier, we're going to get terrible inflation, hasn't arrived yet.
Well, I don't agree. It has arrived, but not in CPI.
Right.
I think CPI is a false measure.
So it's we're basically saying asset inflation because
look at house
we've been
prices.
printing money. Yeah.
Well,
they're not going stratospheric at the moment, are they? It's all
all-time highs.
Right.
The houses, look at the cost of a London house now compared to what it was in 1990.
And you think that's because we've printed money, so people have gone for more stable assets. You don't think that's because of planning restrictions, for example?
Planning restrictions are a huge factor. It's a wash of money going into a market that can't expand.
Right. So you think inflation's already been here. Do you now think we're going to see it on the high street? I'll tell you how inflation has manifested itself in house prices. If I go to the bank and I borrow, 300 grand against my 500 grand house, that's 300 grand of money that's suddenly created and goes into the economy that didn't previously exist. Yeah.
So that's the consequence of a debt-based inflationary system of money. Bitcoin, on the other hand, is a deflationary system of money. It has limited supply. You can't create Bitcoins when you lend, and as a result, its purchasing power
goes up and
increases
up and up.
over time.
Yeah. So how bad do you think this is going to be? Okay, I get what you're saying on CPI. It hasn't been measured in that regard. Although Andy Haldane, the chief economist of the Bank of England, who I quoted in my Times article today, was pointing out some of the numbers. I'm trying to do them by memory now, but I mean, they're pretty scary. It was like, I think it was oil or gas up by 30%, copper up by 17%. I mean, quite big inflation rises that will start to reflect in CPI. What are you expecting to see here? Will it just be actually house prices will go up, Bitcoin will double again, and all right, the weekly shock might be a nudge dearer? Or do you think we could get into, let's say, double-digit inflation or worse, and back to where we were in the 70s, people demanding more wages because prices are going up because and you get into a kind of vicious circle?
I think the first one. The rise in the oil price is extraordinary. It's gone from minus 38. Can you imagine it being, oil was minus $38 in March 2020 to $70 odd today. So it's up nearly $110. You know, that's in a year. That's extraordinary inflation. All commodities have gone through the roof. They've come back a bit in the last month. And commodities tend to reflect real CPI inflation. But we are in this digital technological revolution, and we are seeing such extraordinary increased productivity that is a hugely deflationary force. It will bring prices lower. And so I expect that dynamic, but it suits those who own assets, and it's very, very hard for those who don't. And Bitcoin, I will say this, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and is the revenge of the young on the old for high house prices. The old don't get it. Why would this digital thing have value? Why does an NFT have value? Well, there's only one. Yeah, but I can copy it. Yeah, but this is the original. Yeah, but what you know, the old just do not get it. And the young do.
Right.
And
is that right?
I'm 51.
Is it mainly younger people who've invested in Bitcoin? I don't know what the age.
You look at the I'm 51. I wrote the first book on it. When I used to go to gold conferences, I'd be the youngest person there. I go to Bitcoin conferences, I'm the oldest person there. It's kids, and they get it, and it's their revenge for house price. And all
but is there revenge? I mean, am I suffering because? But you know, if Bitcoin goes up, I'm glad for you guys who've got it, but it's no skin off my nose.
Well, yeah, but you're not an FT journalist who hates it because it's you know, because they've been writing about it for 10 years and they've missed it and they've said no, it's never going to work. It's never going to work. In the meantime, they've missed the greatest opportunity any of us will ever see in our lifetime.
Well, there you go. So there's I mean, we're not paid here to give you financial advice as such, but we are paid to commentate, and Dominic's been right on this for a while.
You have to look at the scalability of it, Mark, because if you think of the pound can only ever grow as big as the UK grows. The pound is limited by the national borders of the UK. The same, even the US dollar is limited to an extent by the borders. It's the global reserve currency, but Bitcoin could be the reserve currency of the internet. That is the global, you know, the potential growth. And
Wasn't there some country I read was thinking of using it as their reserve currency?
Oh, they've already El Salvador.
El Salvador. Yeah.
And the funny thing is, it's often.
And nothing against El Salvador, but that doesn't fill me with confidence necessarily.
It's funny because it's you know, Iran's mining it, Venezuela's mining it, but it's an inherently free market thing. It's a Trojan horse creeping into these things. But the other beautiful thing is, I still think something like 3 billion people around the world are unbanked. They don't have access to basic financial services. They can't get a bank account. You ask yourself, why did landlines not take off and mobile phones did? You don't need a bank account to have a mobile phone. You can pay in cash. As soon as you've got internet connection, you can start transacting in cryptocurrency. Straight away, you can start selling stuff, receiving payments. So immediately you get one of those things, a smartphone, your potential to interact goes beyond your immediate physical vicinity. The growth potential that cryptocurrency, they're all focusing all their efforts on Africa. We've got to get Africans using it, because that's where all the unbanked are. And it's a bit like, do you remember when China just bypassed landlines and went straight to mobile? It'll be a bit like that. They'll just bypass traditional banking and go straight to crypto. And the financial inclusivity it's going to bring is extraordinary.
Okay, well, that's pretty upbeat. Now, I want to ask you a bit before we finish, Dominic, about your latest project. And whenever I hear about an upcoming Frisbee project, I'm always intrigued, but sometimes confused. And this is certainly the case in this one. I am both intrigued and confused. You're working on a film about how Adam Smith, the great Scottish economist, was the founder of modern economics, how Adam Smith, or at least Adam Smith economic principles, became the father of the Edinburgh Fringe.
Yeah.
Talk me through that. That, to my mind, seems to be oil and water.
Well,
how have you mixed them?
This is the great irony, is the Fringe is full of deluded lefties who've got no idea about anything. But they are all... Do you understand how big the Edinburgh Fringe is?
Well, I'm cheating now because you told me just before we went on air, at which point I didn't understand. So I now, if you had asked me how many people go to the Edinburgh Fringe, I would have guessed in a number of thousands, but probably not 10,000 plus.
So the population of Edinburgh is 400,000. In a given year, 4 million people will go through Edinburgh to go to the Fringe. 4 million. 10
to go to the Fringe particularly, not just to
Fringe and the festival.
Right, not just to visit Edinburgh Castle or whatever, right?
It sells more tickets than any other event in the world except the Olympic Games, and the Olympic Games is every 4 years. It's an extraordinarily, well, it was until COVID came along and got it cancelled. It's an extraordinary economic success story, and it happened by accident. The main festival was founded in 1947 to heal the wounds of war through the language of the arts, or something like that.
Sounds absolutely ghastly.
Yeah, awful. And it got like 30 grand of subsidy, and there was this...
Sounds even worse.
Yeah, this is the festival, not the Fringe. And it was founded by a guy called Rudolf Bing, who'd escaped, an Austrian Jew who'd escaped the Nazis, and he founded Glyndebourne, and he put on Glyndebourne and Sadler's Wells and the Halle Orchestra and the Vienna Philharmonic and all this. And I think the line was they were going to bring the highest form of art to the people. Or something
my God.
Yeah.
Spare
Just like...
Yeah.
And then there was a Marxist theatre group in Glasgow who were bringing something like real drama to real people or something like that. And there was a puppeteer and loads of like tiny little acts, and they all wanted to be part of this inaugural Edinburgh Fringe. And Rudolf Bing said, no, you're not good enough. We want the highest form of art, and it's
right.
And so these guys, there were 8 of them, and they were called the Uninvited 8. And they all went to Edinburgh, and like the puppeteer did his show in the lobby of the cinema.
Right.
One guy found a...
This was like street performances then, practically. Yeah.
A bit more than that. They had their own little theatres, and that was in 1947. That was the first one. There were 8, and and they had a bit of success. Following year, 9 of them came. Following year, I don't know, 11 of them came, and there was like 10 or 15%.
This is real inflation.
Yeah. But the effects of compounding, and then suddenly, and they grew so successful that the Fringe was like, the main festival was like, we can't have this. And the most successful show was the Late Night Review. This was in the 50s. And the reason the Late Night Review was so popular was the only place you could go and get a drink after 10 o'clock.
Right.
So everyone went to, so the Fringe was like, the festival was like, we're going to put our own Late Night Review on.
Yeah.
So they poached the Fringe for talent, and they found 4 guys, Alan Bennett, Peter Cook, Dudley Moore, Jonathan Miller, and they put on their own show. And as a snub on the Fringe, they said, we're going to call it Beyond the Fringe, because it's better than the Fringe. Most successful TV programme of the 1960s, made the Edinburgh Festival even more popular. And there was this constant growth, and I think it was by the early 70s, the Fringe had become bigger than the main festival. And it was totally unregulated, no one in charge, lots of individual artists all acting in their own self-interest to go and have fun at the festival, to go and make money at the festival, to go and get discovered at the festival, to go and improve their craft at the festival. Whatever the reason, they were, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, the brewer, it's from their regard their own self-interest.
That's the connection back to...
That's what it comes back to.
The Marxist artistic collective acted out of their own self-interest, and before you know it, they're part of a capitalist success story.
The result is this incredible festival. Everyone acting in their own self-interest makes society a wonderful place. It's self-regulating, it's self-interest creates its own bizarre order. And so that's how the philosophies of Adam Smith manifested themselves in the Edinburgh Fringe.
There you go. Okay, I was intrigued and confused, and now I'm still just intrigued, but no longer
And the best
confused.
thing of all, it happened completely by accident, and all those silly left-wing artists have got no idea they're doing it.
Yeah, so it's kind of a bit Hayekian as well, spontaneous order, right?
Totally.
Non-directed, spontaneous order. So what is this film? When's it come out?
Well, we shot it in last summer, in the year the Fringe didn't happen. And I managed to get interviews with Jimmy Carr, Al Murray, Henning Vane, Arthur Smith, you know, loads of really big names. And I thought, here's my opportunity to crack British television. We're going to produce stuff when everyone else is locked down and there's a shortage of content, and yada yada. And we came up and we presented the idea, endless Zoom calls and emails into the void and all the rest of it, completely ignored by TV and the BBC. And you know, it's just, TV is a closed shop. It's really hard to break into. And then, so we were a bit unhappy. We had this sort of half-finished film, three-quarter finished film. And then this video games, I won't say billionaire, but let's say 100 millionaire. I didn't know, well, let me rephrase it. I got this weird email out of the blue saying I had a near-death experience from COVID, and I was 36 hours from death, and I was in hospital, and I started watching your videos on YouTube, and they really made me laugh. And I want you to know that I really think your videos helped me through this near-death experience, and I'd really like to help you out. And by the way, I'm worth, you know, X £100 million, and I'm a video games entrepreneur.
Right.
How can I help you? So I said, well, we've got this.
You said, I'll take half.
So I said, well, we've got this film that's half finished, and we've got a lot of archival material. We just got a lot of post-production. We'd like X amount of money just to finish it.
So
money was in my account the next day.
Brilliant. So it's going to be finished, but we don't know where it'll go on YouTube or something?
Well, we're going to run it. The Edinburgh Fringe is doing a digital version of the Fringe this year, which will be a total disaster. It's like, there'll be a few loyal people who go, but, you know, the Edinburgh Fringe is real, and YouTube and wherever does the digital. The reason Edinburgh Fringe is like YouTube, and the Edinburgh Festival is like the BBC.
Right.
You know, a commissioner wouldn't commission cat videos.
Yeah.
But they're the biggest, they're the most watched videos in the world on YouTube. You know. So anyway, I think we're going to make it pay-per-view at first, and then eventually we might make it free. We want to try and make a bit of money from it.
Okay. Now I want to end on what I know is a very controversial question, as we've proven over the last hour, Dominic. You and I agree on much. Probably virtually everything, actually. It's probably
except Bitcoin.
Well, no, I don't. I mean, I don't think we disagree. It's just you're more knowledgeable than I am about it, right? So we can agree that I don't know what I'm talking about and you do. But in terms of our philosophy of the world and what we think's right and wrong, we agree on much, probably everything. And we often find ourselves in a minority, quite a small minority, but often a minority in which we're extremely confident we're right. And I'm thinking back to a question in which you and I have exactly the same answer, and we are both in a minority, but I am both completely convinced we are right. But for the benefit of the viewers, explain it now. Why is Roger Moore the best James Bond? There is no, you and I agree on this, 100%. But I know you will be able to explain it better than I, and there's no doubt this is a minority view, but yet another minority view that you and I share.
Because he didn't take himself too seriously. Is that the right answer?
Oh, I suppose that is the right answer. Yeah, the Roger Moore films are sort of semi-comedies, aren't they? They're brilliant, I think, that section.
Yeah. I did a show at the Edinburgh Festival, and I would ask the audience who was the best.
You asked this question at an IEA party.
Oh, did I? I see.
This was actually a filter for soundness. I mean, you said there was sort of, we're going to whittle down the audience, you know, you're in favour of higher taxes, lower taxes, etc., etc., etc. And then out of nowhere came, you know, it was the better Bond, Connery or Moore, and you only allowed Roger Moore fans through that gate.
It's just a slam dunk as far as I'm concerned. Maybe very unpopular in Scotland, the Roger Moore option, but I think it's partly generational, the Bond you grew up with.
Yes, it's like Doctor Who in that regard, right? It's the Bond you grew up with.
I think so, but he brought great humour to the part.
Yeah, I think he was absolutely brilliant. I'm completely with you on that. Yet another minority, idiosyncratic view that you and I have, which is absolutely unambiguously right. Dominic, it's been a pleasure having you.
What is your favourite film of all time?
Oh, my favourite film of all time? You know, I find it so difficult to compare films from different genres.
Say a film you really like.
Reservoir Dogs by Quentin Tarantino. Okay. I think is highly sophisticated. It's actually a very libertarian film.
Oh, is it?
Have you never seen it?
Yes, I have.
Right, so you'll
I liked it, but I didn't have it in the sort of...
So, yeah, I mean, actually, the first time I saw it, it was so violent, I walked out of the cinema, I thought I was going to throw up, and it's just shock horror.
Yeah.
But actually, it's got very deep meaning in it, that the characters are all essentially anonymised because they're called Mr. Pink, Mr. Brown, Mr. Blue. They don't trust each other when they're called that. The only trusting relationships are people who know each other by their first names. Even the Harvey Keitel character with the Tim Roth character, they get to know each other while the Tim Roth character is bleeding to death by actually talking about where they're from, what baseball team they support, and all the rest of it. And I think there's a really interesting thing about how you build trust between people that isn't just a sort of shock horror movie. I think I'm right in also saying it's the first film, or the only film that's ever been made, where the length of the film is actually longer than the length of the action. Right, it's a sort of 100-minute film that only covers 50 minutes of history because there's so many flashbacks. Whereas usually a 100-minute film will cover 10 years of some.
It's like pseudonymous wallets, wallets on Bitcoin and
so the Reservoir Dogs will be up there. Big fan of The Sting as well. I think
I watched that the other day.
That's a pretty classy movie. And I'm a big fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which I'm attempting to write a book about as well, which I think has very libertarian tropes to it.
You see, Hollywood a lot of the time is, the Sting's pretty libertarian. They're taking down the big guy through their own entrepreneurial whatever, through their own inventiveness. But it just seems to be, the media's become almost like the church, and it's got this sort of moral, trying to impose these morals on you the whole time. And if it can rediscover, Hollywood started through guys, self-interest and entertaining and business and giving people what they want and so on. And it's hugely groundbreaking and developments in technology and all the rest of it. So I think if cinema is going to survive, and it always does one way or the other, and theatre and entertainment, and particularly now with all these restrictions with COVID and everything else, it needs to rediscover its inner libertarian.
But you know what? I think the problem is these things start beautiful, and then the kind of corporate wokery grabs hold of it.
The crony
so I'm not as optimistic about the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe as the early films. But you take one of the early films, the hero, Tony Stark, Iron Man, is a billionaire, misogynistic arms dealer, right? He's the hero. That I think is now beginning to get kind of airbrushed out. But that was a fairly counterintuitive sort of superhero to.
Can I just tell you a little story? It might be useful for your book. I was doing another podcast the other day, and we had to interview this guy who's in the prosthetics business to give people, if you've got, I can't remember what the word is he used for it, limb, like if you haven't got an arm, he'll make you a prosthetic arm. And he's discovered like the cost of a traditional prosthetic arm, replacement arm, is like $36,000, and he can make the same arm for 300 quid, something like that. He's totally turning this industry, and the arms he does are much better. They're much lighter. Right. The victims prefer it. Blah blah blah.
Another reason why inflation isn't kicking in the
precisely.
It's just
that's a deflationary thing. And I said, well, what got you started this? And he said, I used to watch Iron Man when I was a kid.
There you go.
And I just always wanted to do it as a result of watching Iron Man. And so that's
well, there you go. You've got Adam Smith and the Edinburgh Fringe. I've got Tony Stark, Iron Man, and the advances in the prosthetic industry. Fantastic. Dominic, we've overrun our time. It's been fantastic having you with us. Always a pleasure to see you, my friend.
Good to shake hands with somebody again.
Buy the book. You can get this on Amazon. Dominic only brought along, I've got the hardback edition at home. That will cost you 20 quid, I think, on Amazon, but well worth it.
I don't think the hardback exists anymore.
Well, there you go. Well, you can make me a direct, I'm investing in hardback Dominic Frisby books rather than in Bitcoin because there's now so much money chasing so many rare products. But I really recommend Daylight Robbery. Fantastic read. Thanks to all of you for watching, joining us either on the Zoom side or the YouTube side. Particular thanks to our REA online patrons. You're the guys who help keep the lights on. if you're willing to throw a few pence or Bitcoin our way to keep our digital work going, then please head over to patreon.com/IEA London. We'll put a link in the chat and in the show notes below. And we really appreciate your support. It's not completely cheap to run the whole studio, the lighting, everything else, but if you can spare us a few pennies, we can keep on air. Greatly appreciate it. Unlike the BBC, I can't forcibly charge you £157.50 per year. We've got more events coming up. I'll be back on Wednesday evening with my regular Live with Littlewood. That's at 6 o'clock. On Thursday, the 24th of June at 6 p.m. Also, we'll be hosting an event about the Conference of the Parties, Conference 9, and its impact on vapors. We'll be joined by Matt Ridley, Chris Snowden and Louis Holbrook. I've mentioned the book. Buy it. Hit like, hit subscribe on the YouTube side. My thanks again to Dominic Frisby. Have a very good evening. Stay safe, stay free. Over and out.